the map, remember, the big picture. Uh, the letter begins with Christian identity and then Christian responsibility and concludes with Christian community. But in the middle of this big section, there are a variety of arenas of responsibility, including toward one another, toward God, and toward the world. Last week we looked at the church's mission having to do with the stewardship of God's light, the light we have been called into out of darkness. I see streaming has joined us. For you, those of you who are streaming, sorry for the fancy version, but this is your QR code if you're streaming. If you want to download the handout, it'll be available to you using that QR code. So today we're dealing with relationships with the world. And so I'd say that's a fairly timely issue. Politics, marriage, household. Well, let's see if we can find something relevant as we go through these verses today. But, as Paul says in Ephesians, that we are to redeem the time because the days are evil. And the solution to that, the answer to redeeming the time, is learning how to walk wisely. And if there's a subject that brings out the great need for wisdom, it's these worldly relationships. So shall we ask for wisdom as we begin with prayer? God, you have promised that if we lack wisdom, we only must ask and you will give it. And so we readily, happily, and humbly confess that we lack wisdom and ask that you would give it to us in abundance by your Spirit, so that we might conduct our affairs in the world in such a way that does not belie the imperishable inheritance that you have given us, and does not betray the kingship of Lord Jesus Christ in our lives. We pray these things in his name. Amen. So 1 Peter 2, starting at verse 11. Up to this point, relationships have been a constant topic. Back in chapter 1, brotherly love. Chapter 1, holiness. Be holy as God is holy. And Colby, thank you for helping the folks back in the back quiet down so we can hear better inside the room. Thank you for doing that. A royal priesthood, which means a relationship to God, but as we saw, being royal priests also involves a relationship to the world. And a relationship to the world and how we have been ransomed from a pointless life. Like that is the futile ways of our forefathers. So really, even though the letter started out with high theology, relationships have always been in play, because followers of Christ have been freed from a certain relationship to their world and the futile ways of their forefathers to a new relationship with God as Father, because we have this imperishable inheritance, one which will not pass away. So it's not surprising that we would continue to contemplate relationships. But even as we think about it, we've already been warned we need to brace ourselves. Back in chapter 1, verse 13, we saw that what Peter's admonition there is literally gird up the loins of your mind. Don't try to picture that, but get ready. Plant your feet because a wind is coming or blows might come. And so you have to be ready because of those changed relationships with God, one another, and the world. And so the challenge that begins our text this morning is to live honorably in the context of those new relationships. Chapter 2, verse 11, Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles, see a new relationship to the world now, the world in which you live, as sojourners and aliens, to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul, and keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable. And so, in our new status as sojourners and aliens, even living in the land of our birth, we are no longer citizens, ultimately, of those kingdoms, but rather of the kingdom of God. And so, in saying this, verse 12 explains why, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. And this is a clear statement that we're not only to live as Christians based on God's message, but we're supposed to live according to God's means. In other words, the way God wants us to live. There's a wonderful sermon by Francis Schaeffer that I think, are you reading it? For the women's study, but the one I'm thinking of is called The Lord's Work in the Lord's Way. And Schaeffer goes into how, we can do a lot of things in the power of the flesh, even good things. And we can do them in the name of God, but how can we expect God to bless us and make us fruitful if we're not willing to do things God's way? There are lots of notable accomplishments done in the name of God, but unless they're done in God's way, according to God's means, they're really not the fruit of God's work. They're the fruit of human effort. And so God's plan is that when his people are spoken against because of their honorable ways, that God will be glorified through that. It's not, our first choice probably, but it is God's means, based on God's message. Now, why will Paul now turn to talk about our relationship to the world? We're going to see our relationship to the civil magistrate. We're going to look at relationships within the household of God, which is much more than just family life. And then I'm planning on running out of time to talk about husbands and wives. If we were to get there, why those three things now in terms of clarifying our relationship to the world? Well, think about one of the things that you receive when you come to faith in Christ is you receive freedom. What does Paul say? For freedom Christ has set us free, in Galatians 5. He says, but don't use your freedom, what? As an occasion for the flesh, but instead serve one another. So think about gospel freedom in relationship to the world. When you name Christ as Lord, there is no greater Lord. What is the hymn? All thrones and dominions will bow to him. Psalm 2 says he will either rule the kings of the earth with a rod of iron, or they will kiss the Son. I mean, Christ is Lord is a massive political statement. And so you might think, okay, I'm free in Christ. He is my king. Why do I have to obey earthly kings? So you can see how gospel freedom could be misapplied or misunderstood, that when people become Christians, now they're going to become revolutionaries, rebels, anarchists. What about in the household? We'll talk about the household, but it's the primary social unit in Greco-Roman society. And if you have slaves that become Christians, they might exercise their freedom by saying, I quit, which they couldn't. But but they might, even if they can't walk away, they might try to run away. We have a book of the New Testament about that, right? The book of Philemon. Or they might just become sullen and sulky. Realize, under the belief that they're really not bound to their masters anymore, but they're only bound to Christ as their master. Well, and you can imagine, too, when it talks about husbands and wives here, it's talking principally about households in which the wife is a believer, but the husband is not, or vice versa. You can imagine a Christian wife reacting or relating to her pagan husband in such a way that would be disrespectful or demeaning, superior, prideful, whatever. I've known over the course of time, a non-Christian husband who, feels like Jesus is now is a rival in the relationship over himself, or it can be the same thing in reverse. So you can see how gospel freedom now presents a set of challenges so that Christians who now have this imperishable inheritance from God, who is their Father now, could easily misapply or misuse their freedom in these various realms. And so it makes sense, doesn't it, why Peter would want to address these things. So a very important concept when we come to this section of 1 Peter is what is known as the household code. In Greco-Roman society, so we're in the Roman Empire, right, heavily influenced by the Greek tradition. So in Greco-Roman society, the primary social unit, well, let me ask you this question. What's the primary social unit in our society? Some people are saying home. Yes. I'm not asking about your families. Yes. Yeah, it's the self. I sing the song of myself, right? I think, therefore I am. And we're living in a time where the absolute rights of the individual are colliding with what? The good of the broader group. And so in Western society over the last 2 or 3 or 4 centuries, the primary unit of society is the individual liberties. Now, this is not true when you go west to the east or to the global south. It's only true in the West, but nevertheless, it's strange to us, even as Christians. So a lot of you are given the right answers, but if it were that easy, then the society would get it too. But the Greco-Roman household code saw the household as the primary social unit. Now, this would not just include nuclear family, because a typical household might employ servants for various roles and various statuses. The head of household would be representative of their social unit. Interestingly, in the Greco-Roman household, it was often the wife or the woman of the house who was the manager of everyday affairs, or as we say sometimes, domestic engineers. But the importance of the household code becomes evident in a couple of different ways. One is, what we call George Washington. He was the what of our country. So we call George Washington the father of our country. Even there, you see in the 18th century, the political leader taking on kind of the metaphor, the mantle, which suggests that all the people are one big, if not happy, a family. But this is also true in the ancient world. Caesar owned the title father. We see this with other things. Shepherds were often a title that kings took for themselves. And so even though the household is a primary social unit, which made the father the most important figure, it's also that household unit that really shapes society in general, society's outlook. So the common good, patriotism, and those kind of values are important under a society where the household code dominates. Now, there's another reason this is important. Paul often refers to God's people as the household of God. And it's not just because somehow the Christian church is a family sort of in the abstract, but Paul is actually drawing on that cultural concept of the household to say that the Christian church is actually a different kind of household. And so it would be interesting if we were studying Paul to go through and look and see how the household of God is to be organized in contrast to society. Because we would see that the values within the household and family of God are radically different in some ways than the culture. Thank God. I always go back to 1 Corinthians 12, where the weakest are the most important or necessary, and the people deserving the least honor are the ones most honored. The household of God is turned upside down, because in the kingdom of God, who is the greatest? The one who serves. And so the Lord himself served in order to exemplify that. But because Paul uses this concept to describe the household of God, we could potentially be a little bit confused, because Peter is not using it that way. Peter is not drawing upon the household code to say how Christians are to relate to one another. But rather, Peter is drawing upon the idea of the household code to describe how Christians are to relate to the world around them. Does that make sense? It's an important interpretive check mark so that we can read what Peter's saying properly. Because if we're trying to read Peter the same way we read Paul, when he talks about household, we'll get confused fairly quickly. But it's using the metaphor of household, which is a cultural concept, using it to describe relationships of Christians to the world, not Christian relationships to one another as Paul did. So those are some important preliminaries to understand what we're going to encounter in these verses. Just put it this way. By the way, I've given you a number of points on the handout, including some scripture verses to support what I just said. But here's the conclusion of it all. While Paul uses the household metaphor to describe life within the church, Peter employs it to describe how a Christian is to relate to the world around himself or herself. We are part of a bigger household than just the church. Or as the lesson title says, we're citizens of two kingdoms at the same time. Make sense so far? Okay. Well, if I keep going slower, I will not get to husbands and wives. So, no, my intention is we would get to there. So, the first set of instructions is relationships to human institutions. Look at verses 13 through 17. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him, to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. Now, what you have in those couple of verses is a very important teaching on the role of the civil magistrate. Romans 13 explains why God established something called the civil magistrate. The civil magistrate, according to Romans 13, and you can turn there if you like, to Romans 13, let every person be subject to the governing authority. Sounds very similar to what Peter is saying. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. So let's not misunderstand. When Peter says, be subject to every human institution, when he says human institution, he's not saying of human invention. he's saying institutions that are of human realm or reference. That is, institutions that relate to human beings. Because Romans 13 is very clear that human institutions are not human creations, but they are God's creation. I am reminded of, was it Will Rogers that said that the nation is never no more in peril than when Congress is in session. No, that used to be funny. I guess it's kind of lost its edge. Makes everybody a little sad these days. But of course, Paul and Peter are both saying this about very imperfect human institutions. And that's part of the point, isn't it? Peter and Paul are not saying this about, the acme of human democracy, whenever that was. We know revolutions were, the French or the American revolutions were not always very pleasant to look below the surface. We're glad we live where we do. We're glad we have the institutions that we do. But we even at our best, we are not that great. But Paul is saying God has established those. Therefore, Romans 13:2, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgments. And he goes on to explain, similarly to Peter, that the state exists to punish evildoers and reward the good. So if you want more on this, if you're unfamiliar maybe with the Reformed understanding of this, the Westminster Confession has a whole chapter on civil government. I've got two paragraphs here that we can look at. God, the supreme Lord and King of all the world, hath ordained civil magistrates to be under him over the people for his own glory and the public good. Now, this doesn't require the acknowledgement of that by the civil magistrate. It's not conditioned upon the civil magistrate even being a righteous person, although they will be accountable to God for their conduct. And to this end hath armed them with the power of the sword for the defense and encouragement of them that are good, and for the punishment of evildoers. And so how does God is king. There's nowhere that God is not king ever. But how he is king is depending on the context. He rules over creation through providence. He rules over his church as a saving kingdom through Christ. And one thing Peter is making sure we don't confuse is the different ways in which God reigns. We like the world to be like a pickup basketball game or a pickup soccer game where you call your own fouls. Or I've known collegiate tennis players, if you're playing a collegiate match against another school, you start off without a referee or a linesman, as they say. But often, I don't know if anybody has any experience with this, maybe in high school tennis, often what happens when a match gets intense, you call for a linesman, you call for a referee. Why? Because fairness becomes a subjective matter very quickly in human conflict and contest. So the point here being the civil magistrate is not a surgical scalpel. The civil magistrate's a blunt instrument. And fairness is secondary to the restraint of evil. I don't want to go on about this, but it's been interesting. I was talking to somebody recently about the Arab Spring that swept across the Mideast and North Africa, which resulted in chaos continually to this day, where dictators maintained order in a more effective way, and for the better good of most people, anarchy is actually creating chaos and want and human need on unprecedented scales. But that's a side issue from where we're going today. The second paragraph 4, in Westminster Confession 23, it is the duty of people to pray for magistrates, to honor their persons, to pay them tribute. Paul says, "Let us lift up holy hands in prayer." So that we might experience peace in the civil order, so that the gospel might flourish. It's to the good of all people when there is public order, but especially for the gospel. To pay them tribute or other dues, to obey their lawful commands, and be subject to their authority for conscience sake. Infidelity or difference in religion doth not make void the magistrate's just and legal authority. So this is the context in which Peter is speaking, that God has ordained the civil magistrate for the good of all people, and Christians aren't exempted from that, but for perhaps other reasons as well, as Peter is concerned. So God has a purpose for the civil magistrate, and the Christian is to relate to the civil magistrate according to God's purpose for them. In other words, when we experience persecution, we need to do all we can to make sure it's for doing good rather than for doing evil. I think it was John Stott that said, when he was commenting on the Beatitudes, "Blessed are you when men cast all kinds of insults against you." He said, "Now make sure it's for that reason and not because you're being a jerk." Because some of you know a friend of mine who was pastor in South Florida who would not put a Christian fish on his bumper sticker because if somebody attacked him while he was driving down the road, he couldn't be sure he could shoot back because they might be doing it because he's a Christian. Well, okay, that's maybe not as funny either if you're from South Florida. But if he had no fish on his bumper sticker, he could just say, I have the right to defend myself. Anyway, those of you who know the man I'm talking about understand the twisted humor there. So back to the chapter in 1 Peter 2. Be subject to them, for this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil. See, there's the misuse of Christian freedom. But instead, living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. There's a nice little kind of fourfold structure that you see on your handouts at least. Honor everyone matches with honor the emperor. Love the brotherhood matches with fear of God as a nice pairing. So what kind of questions do we have about honoring the civil magistrate that what I've said or what Peter has said has raised questions about? Yes, in the very back. Leah. Yes. So, and this is where Acts chapter 4, and remember I've said a couple of times as we've been going, it's really interesting how Peter's letter here is paralleling a lot of Peter's experience. So Peter found himself in exactly this situation. The question was, what about when the civil magistrate requires you to do something wrong? And so when Peter was commanded to no longer preach the gospel, he said, I have to obey God rather than man. And so whether the persecution comes from the general public or from the magistrate, it has to be for doing the will of God rather than for doing wrong. And so this is the trick, isn't it? To know when and how to resist the civil magistrate when we're being commanded to do wrong. Sarah? This is unclear, but it's quite possible it's Nero. But it could be someone else, but I think the best location is Nero. Not a nice guy. And And I'm going to mention in a few moments a book book titled Quo Vadis, or actually is made into a movie several times too. And so this heightens the exhortation, doesn't it, Sarah? That this is not being said about your favorite president in your lifetime, which of course is, well, never mind. But it's said about a really awful civil magistrate. And so here's the moral calculation that is so hard but also so timely, that when we decide to resist or even complain, we've got to make sure that it's for doing good and not for just being rebellious or resistant. It doesn't mean we have to like what the civil magistrate asks. And of course, in our political context, there's all kinds of redress. I met a man, Ben Nichols introduced me to a man a couple of days ago who is a pastor in northern India. He works for Voice of the Martyrs as well, who whenever he travels, every night he calls his wife to tell her he got safely to his hotel, because many pastors in his region do not arrive safely. And so we need to take measure. We need to take measure of our context in relation to the world context and the history of the world context to see, our sensitivity levels are heightened, perhaps beyond what a Christian should be. So let's look at the next one: servants and masters. This is one more thing about this civil magistrate. This is a positive command to seek the public good as well. And those who serve in office or in career diplomacy and state and all the other departments of government, those who serve in the military, it is a good thing for a Christian to do a good thing. And sometimes our negative attitude toward the world would cause us to see involvement in the world as some kind of obligation to maintain holiness, and there are traditions that see it that way. But this is actually these words from Peter actually implicitly endorse working for the public good, and that can be in the private sector as well as in the public sector. It is a good thing to do a good thing, and not all the good things to do are explicitly Christian things. Christian employers, Christian diplomats, Christian business developers, Christian school teachers and administrators, and every lawful calling, which is a calling from God, is an arena in which to do the public good. People love when you show up, don't they, Andrew? Yeah. Well, I didn't say when you left, but it's when you showed up. I said that to my drain relief person the other day, or not the other day, but a few months ago. Andrew knew about. So servants and masters. Here's an important context in which to be reminded that we have to read what's being said and not what not's being said. What does Paul say to servants? Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. Now, let's step back to the Greco-Roman household code. This is, the household was not just a primary social institution, it's a primary economic institution. Think Downton Abbey, Bob's favorite show. No? That was a random guess. But, the servants lived below stairs. They received their meals as well as their service from the household. There could be bad households and good households, and it was actually quite a striking thing when the chief butler and the chief head of the servants got married and actually got their own home together. That was radical. And so don't picture chattel slavery, which involves kidnapping and murder and forced deportation of people. That's the kind of slavery we're maybe the most ready to think of, which is awful. It's a great, continues to be a great blight on our country. Wendell Berry, in his book, The Hidden Wound, talks about how chattel slavery wounded the white soul as deeply, and is a continuing wound upon our nation. But what Peter is describing here is the way in which somebody could have a secure and stable existence, to live under the umbrella, if you will, of a patriarch's household. And so it doesn't have to be a kind and just master, but the servant, while rendering service and suffering unjustly, verse 19, verse 20, for what credit is it when you sin and are beaten for it and you endure? Well, but if when you do good and suffer, for it you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. It's a grace, charis. It's a grace when you suffer unjustly. Now, we don't have the time, unfortunately, to unpack all the details of, are you compelled to remain even to the point of death? And these instructions have to be qualified. But we can't let the general admonition die the death of 1,000 qualifications by absolutizing what Peter's saying. No, the slave who is now free in Christ must not make their civil freedom a cause for Christ, but rather they should remain in the household and give evidence of their Christian hope. Verse 21 explains why. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. There's a quote I read in pastoral ministry class every year from doesn't matter who it's from. He says, nothing worse shall happen to you in ministry than happened to Christ. Students are like, what? Wait, I know that story. But that's the implication here, isn't it? That, look, Christ gave us an example for how you deal with unjust authority. I will say this: the moral authority of the civil rights movement came from the willingness to endure such tremendous suffering. And if you read the history, it was driven, it was motivated, it was empowered by a Christian commitment to follow the example of Christ. There's a wonderful book by Charles Marsh called God's Long Summer that shares the story of people like Fannie Lou Hamer, who are just incredible, heroic people who believed so much in the gospel they were willing to suffer for a just cause and suffer great injustice. And so Christ himself, when he was reviled, he did not revile in turn. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. God is the one who judges justly. God will judge all persons. And so vengeance, elsewhere it says in Romans 13, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And people often misquote that to say, vengeance is mine, but in the context of Romans 13, it's we are liberated from having to be vengeful because God will deal with the sins of unrighteous people. I mentioned the book Quo Vadis, written by the Pole Hendrik Sienkiewicz. Does anybody listen to the Great Books podcast? Nobody? Comes out of Hillsdale College. This week's feature was Quo Vadis, but the book Quo Vadis it's a late 19th century book. It's been made into movies 5 different times over the course of the 20th century. It's about a Roman patrician, an upper class man who falls in love with a Christian slave. And this is during the time of Nero. And part of the reason he falls in love with her is her virtue, because she's a Christian. I won't get into the complications of the plot, but there's a scene, and this comes from an apocryphal work called The Acts of Peter. It's not a biblical, it's not an inspired book. It's not even clear that it's historical, but this movie uses a scene in which Peter is fleeing Rome because of the heat of persecution. And along the way, he encounters the risen Christ. And Peter asks Jesus, Quo vadis, Domine? Where are you going, Lord? And the answer that Christ gives is that he is going to Rome since Peter is fleeing. He's going to Rome to die again because Peter is fleeing. Now, again, this is not a historical incident, but it's a wonderful illustration of, when I know a pastor who, when things were getting dicey in anticipation of Y2K, and people are expecting apocalyptic things to be happening, he tried to convince his elders that they all needed to move to the country. And his elders, his lovely, beautiful lay elders, without all of his theological training, said, the hireling flees at the sign of danger. And our shepherd went to Jerusalem toward the cross, not away from it. And so this is simply Peter's admonition he himself now finds himself in Rome, anticipating perhaps what Jesus had said to him, that when he is old, he would be led by others. And of course, we know from tradition, a strongly historical tradition, that Peter himself was crucified in Rome. So, wives and husbands, any comments about slaves and masters? I know this is very, very cursory. It would apply easily in the employment context today, or in other socially binding relationships where we endure discomfort, we endure derision, and we do it cheerfully because we know that our Savior suffered in the same way. And actually, it's a sign of membership in him. In fact, I've been meaning to say this in the whole letter. Do you ever read 1 Peter and think about, why isn't life harder for me? Why do I not experience more difficulties as a Christian? That's worth asking, isn't it? We'll talk about suffering more explicitly next week. One of my students, who was a Chinese church pastor, was ashamed that he'd only been in prison for 3 years when all of his peers had been in prison for twice, 3, 4 times as long. But yes, Jim?
Well, a lot of us are concerned with what's going on in our country today. Do we get more comfort out of, we'll just follow Jesus' example, how much he suffered, or we follow it by saying, well, God is in control. Which one gives more peace to your life?
Well, it's both and. The question is, which is a greater comfort, knowing God is in control or that Christ suffered? Well, God, it's what I said last week. The cross was God's power move. This was not his strategic retreat. So, and we know that on the other side of the cross is life and resurrection. In fact, in chapter 1, we have been born again by the resurrection from the dead. The world, the Christian can say this, the world can do its worst. Joe Moon was describing to me an Aristotle work. I should have asked him as a follow-up where it's located. But even Aristotle at one point says, the world, what's the worst the world can do? Just kill me. But is that the worst? I mean, if Aristotle could say that out of his Greek philosophy, I mean, how much more can the Christians say that? Because and to a certain extent, our anxiety is based on having set our minds on the things below rather than the things above. It comes from hoping in this life only rather than, that's a phrase from 1 Corinthians 15 about the resurrection, right? And so our desire to be earthly good can sometimes turn into a desire to experience earthly good rather than experience the life of the cross. I don't know if that makes sense in response to your question. I think both are important parts of the Christian hope. So wives and husbands. You've heard the third rail. I know Brandon knows this expression. He worked in Washington, D.C. This is why politicians will never vote or anything to do with Social Security. It's called a third rail issue. What's a third rail? Well, you've got a commuter train that runs on electricity. The outside rails are where the wheels go, but there's a middle rail that has the electricity in it. I don't know if they do this anymore, but the third rail is the one that will electrocute you. Where I come from, they say electrocute, but electrocute you. And so I assigned one of my students to preach on these verses 1 through 7 of chapter 3, and he said, "What did I do wrong that you're making me preach on these?" And he did the right thing. He ran his sermon completely by his wife. She came and sat and listened to him while he preached it. She gave him an A, so well done. But again, we need to make sure we're not hearing something that's not being said. So when Peter says, likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, it's not saying be subject in the same way that slaves are subject to their masters. It's saying similarly, but it's not framing wives as servants to their husbands. Now, I said earlier, this envisions a situation which the husband is not a believer, so that even if some do not obey the word, that's in verse 1. And the language of obeying the word as the language of belief is been introduced already at the end of chapter 1. So these are wives whose husbands are not believers, and by being subject to them, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. So the goal here is for this unbelieving husband to come to know the Lord. Over the course of mine and Vicky's lifetime, we've known a number of very godly, very commendable, exemplary women in this role who in some cases have seen this good outcome. But the point is that when you become a Christian wife and you read what Paul says in Galatians, there is no longer Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female. This could cause an appropriate exercise of Christian freedom to rebel against the domestic order. Now, how is that to be specifically worked out? Verse 3, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear. Now, this is not an explicit prohibition against external adornment, but it is a comparative statement because it goes on to say, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit. You can look plenty of places in Scripture to see beauty as a thing that reflects God. God is true, good, and beautiful. Human activities are to reflect God's beauty. But here's what it's saying, and I'd say it as simply as possible. Don't let your outside outshine your inside. That's what Peter is saying here. The kind of fish you catch is a function of the bait you use. That's more for those who haven't caught a fish yet, I guess. That this is good counsel. The kind of fish you catch depends on the kind of bait you use. Now, this is going off of Peter's purpose a little bit here, and where's that third rail? But it's very difficult when you see, whether you're a man or a woman, and you're sort of, you see peers as competition for finding a good mate. That's a reality. It's very tempting to adopt the rules of your peers and play the game of your peers and just try to play it better. And I think this is not a good assessment of whether this pressure applies to women. It says something not very good about men, that men aren't willing to look upon the person, but rather are so inclined to look upon the exterior. And the same thing could be said in reverse, right? That the pressures that men might feel to present themselves outwardly in certain ways in order to attract the interest of a woman doesn't encourage development of the inner person, the hidden person of the heart. Now, one great solution to this is not just to not hang around with peers all the time. But if you're a man, find older men. If you're a young woman, find older women to measure and model after rather than peers. Because the principle here is not to let the outside outshine the inside. So I'm going to pause here and see what I've said that's been misunderstood, because I couldn't have possibly meant something wrong or do I have any testimony? Do I have a witness at all? I'm sure if we sat around a circle and started talking, men and women both would talk about the pressures that they have felt. Even if you are married, the pressures. I work with a college group in the Southeast Conference annually, and my last trip to work with them, they were saying one of the big problems that the staff were dealing with in terms of discipling students was the students were, just they were already Botoxing at 19, 20 years old. And he said, "Why in the world? These are beautiful men and women. These are like prime of life, human species." And they said, "Well, it's mostly because their parents are already doing it. So their 40, 45, 50-year-old parents are doing it." And so now that's not coming from self-conscious adoption. That's coming from cultural patterns that really depend upon people making a lot of money. We need to realize how much money is made from getting us to do things that seemingly benefit ourselves, but really only sell products and services. That's where the world captures our hearts. And so, as Christians, we have all these things from God. We have an imperishable inheritance. We have a family. We have the promise of the resurrection. And yet, what did C.S. Lewis say? We go about making mud pies in the slums instead of a day at the beach. I'm trying to pause. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I'm actually getting back to the text.
Yeah.
Sorry, but
No.
if he's talking to women who are married to unbelievers, it seems very contradictory. The example he uses is then Sarah and Abraham.
So the question is, if he's talking about wives married to unbelieving husbands, why does he use Sarah and Abraham as example? Well, I don't want to make a strict distinction here between regenerate and non-regenerate, but Abram showed some significant failures along the way. these are failures of faith, not trusting in God's promise. And so it even applies within a married household, I would say. That's maybe my simplest answer. I think I need to say something about verse 7, because I told my student, I said, you spent 15 minutes talking about verses 1 through 6, and I know husbands only get one verse, but I think you need to spend the same amount of time talking about both. And that might be an objection, like, why is there such short instruction? Is Peter picking on women? And the reason I would say that no, first of all, the attention, the space being given to women's place is sort of mind-blowing in relation to the cultural norms. The status, the worth, and the value that comes from what Peter's saying here is well beyond what would be typically regarded in the Greco-Roman household. In other words, it's not negative attention, it is positive attention. Secondly, if you've had two kids, one does something outrageous and the other reacts in an inappropriate way, they're the smarter one, they're the more mature one. You see, you might talk more to the second one, but then you turn to the first one, you say, stop being an idiot. I mean, it's like an omnibus rebuke that just covers a lot of territory. And I think that's how you think about verse 7. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in two ways. In an understanding way, showing honor. That would be about as countercultural as you could get. It's a short statement, but it is the wider brush, to say it that way. Showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel. Now, don't react and think that Peter is ontologically saying women are always weaker. As a general observation, it is true in that world, especially economically, physically, and so forth, that women depend upon men for certain things associated with strength. And that's still a lot true, even though the playing field has been leveled a great deal in our society. It's an observational statement, not a prescriptive statement. But that they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. You want to be spiritual? Love your wife as a fellow heir of the imperishable inheritance of the resurrected Christ. She's not a secondary beneficiary. She is a co-heir through direct relationship with Christ if she puts her faith and trust in Christ, and therefore you should treat her as an equal, a joint heir. By the way, that's a lovely phrase from the traditional wedding service, heirs together the grace of life, which you may have heard in the wedding vows and traditional services. Well, anyway, this is almost malpractice worthy to go so quickly over such verses subject to misapplication and misunderstanding. But I think it does help to step back and say, Peter is here trying to help instruct us in how we're to relate to the world. We relate to the world in seeking the public good by being good citizens, even while we are faithful disciples. Within the authority structures of the household, which I would say the most complete analogy would be employment or similar types of situations, we are to be willing and obedient servants. And then in the domestic life, in marriage in particular, we are to reflect our Christian freedom not in rebellious ways, but in ways that are, again, for the greater good of both partners in marriage. Any comments or questions? Here we are. Yes? Yeah, so the comment is, that the warning of Peter is, for if husbands do not treat their wives this way, their prayers will be hindered. It kind of speaks for itself. It's a little bit mysterious as to exactly what that means, but It's bad. Yeah, and you're not a godly man by being a tyrant in the home. And whatever version of masculinity you choose to wear, it needs to be a version of masculinity that ennobles and cultivates a healthful life in your wife. Or otherwise, God is not interested in what you want. Let's play it that way. Well, I think we're slowing down a little bit, or at least we're not dealing with such difficult passages. I appreciate your patience and how fast we're going. I'll just conclude this way. You know, Samuel's here again. I'm not picking on him. I've learned so much from being his dad. But you know, one of the early lessons as we were driving home from soccer games, you know, even 4-year-olds, you know, when it's just bowling pin soccer, you know, toddlers running around knocking each other down. You know, Samuel will remember this because I think it got tense once, you know, a few times. You know, I would say the one thing we don't do is complain about the referees. The referees are like weather, you know, they're just there, right? But college football Saturday, my other name for college football Saturdays is watching all my friends explain why their team lost because the referees did a bad job. We're living in a world of people raised being told by their parents it's the referee's fault. I mean, this is all we're dealing with culturally, right? It's the referee's fault. It's the authority's fault. We're dealing with the decline and the dissolution of institutions, and there's chaos that's infringing upon us simply because we exerted, and this is true of Christians almost as much as it is non-Christians in my observation, that our individual rights are being trampled on by the collective good. It doesn't mean we don't have redress in our society. It doesn't mean in fact, we should enter the civic arena for the public good. But God says, don't blame the referee. I've ordained the referee. Do your best. And make sure whatever you do that people know what you do is because you're a Christian and it speaks truly of who Christ is. So you have to ask, what do people think of Christians when they listen to the civic conversations? What do they think Christians believe? What do they think Christians believe in? What do they think Christian hope is in when they listen to Christians in the public sphere? That's the challenge for us. Good news. The Lord is King, so let's sing. We're going to skip the little refrain at the end for time's sake. Rejoice, the Lord is King, your Lord and King adore. Mortals give thanks and sing and triumph evermore. Lift up your heart, lift up your rejoice. Rejoice in glorious hope. Jesus the Judge shall come and take his servants up to their eternal home. Lift up your heart, lift up your voice, rejoice again, I say, rejoice. You're dismissed.